Well, good morning, everybody, and I'd like to take a moment to thank Tani, Megan, and everyone at the Chow Center for pulling together what has proven to be a very stimulating and very enlightening set of conversations, and I'm very honored to be able to be here as part of it. Before I get started with the paper proper, I want to spend a little bit of time introducing it. It does come a very collaborative conversation between Alex Barksdale and myself over a period of time, and many others. Alex Barksdale graduated from Rice with a dual degree in anthropology and the study of women, gender, and sexuality earlier this spring. And here, anthropology honors thesis was about Houston Arch, looking at the ways that the different organizations and individuals within it collaborated and worked for a greater good. One of the things that Z paid attention to was the context of race. And so that began a series of discussions that implicated myself, because my position in this is a facilitator and administrator within Houston Arch. I call the meetings and end up standing up there talking with people about what's going on and introducing other people and helping things to move along, make sure that minutes get out to people. So the fact of the presence of race and the absence of race in our collective work and hear attention to that is really important to me. So first, what I'd like to do is give you a brief history of Houston Arch, and then following that sketch, talk about some of the theoretical frameworks that Alex and I started thinking with. Following that, we'll discuss a specific example that came from one of the participant organizations in Houston Arch, a recent exhibition that gives us a little bit of leverage on thinking about anti-racist practices in queer archives. So, one of the initial sparks for Houston Arch can be traced back to 2008. For the month of June, Pride Houston arranged for a history display to be installed in the lobby of a bank at the corner of Richmond and Montrose, just up the street. It contained artifacts from an archive and videos from community leaders that had been collected by students at Rice University through the Introduction to LGBT Studies class. At the opening reception, some of the people there were walking around and then said, well, what happens to all of this after this exhibition comes down? Which in a way pointed both to the ephemerality of the venue itself and potentially also the objects on offer. Another spark came just a few months later when the Houston Public Library convened a meeting of organizations and individuals to talk about what it would mean to actually break down some of the barriers between the people who'd been collecting history in Houston. A lot of the people in there had been collecting for decades, but had not yet met each other. So this was a really big eye-opener for all of us. And those two sparks set off a cascade of conversations that culminated in a meeting, again at the Houston Public Library in 2009, January, where we gathered to talk specifically about what it would mean to try to preserve this stuff digitally. Since so many people were doing it, digital seemed to be the way to go so that everybody could keep doing what they were doing, but do it together, potentially. So since then, we've taken on a name, Houston Arch. We've applied for grants to the National Endowment for the Humanities, to the Council on Library and Information Resources. And the group decided that the way to make everything work was for us to be a kind of non-hierarchic structure, so everyone could be their own identity. There was no governance. We did establish an advisory board, which is proud to have on it notable figures like the historian John D'Amelio and our mayor, Anise Parker. In the context of all of this, though, we also realized that race was something we wanted to pay attention to very closely from the beginning. And so we started thinking about how that would affect our internal politics, our internal discourse, and our practices. Specifically, we wanted to make sure that we reached out to African American women of color and other women of color who had been collecting histories on their own, but weren't showing up in specific places, like necessarily the meeting at the Houston Public Library. There were very few women of color there. So what happened with that? And that was kind of the arc that Alex Barksdale began to trace. So while over 200 people have contributed to Houston Arch over time, these 5 organizational characters also became very dominant. I want to talk to you about them for a little bit. One of them is the University of Houston, Rice University, and 3 nonprofit archives in town. One of them is the Transgender Foundation of America, another is the Charles Botts LGBT Collection, and the third, which we'll talk a little bit more about today, is the Gulf Coast Archive and Museum of GLBT History, Inc. or GCAM. It was established as a 501c3 in 1999, and a lot of the organizational characters that started it are still with it to this day, including its curator. Like the BOTS and TFA, the Transgender Foundation, GCAM contains a wide array of different objects: books, papers, newspapers, locally produced periodicals, photographs. But GCAM also has a distinguishing mark in that it likes to collect clothing, specifically T-shirts. So I think Ann Cvetkovich's reference to T-shirts is further enumerated in that. So it was into this vast array of people and organizations that Alex Barksdale plunged as Z began her fieldwork in the fall of 2010. As Z documents, those of us involved in bringing these diverse people together were from the outset explicitly conscious of the politics of race. We undertook specific initiatives, and at the same time, we and Barksdale were confronted with a stark reality. Since 2009, the majority of those regularly attending the meetings, even after the beginning, were white. Moreover, although Z recruited participants both at meetings and through the email list, again, 200 plus people with diversity among it, most of the interviewees also identified as white. So Barksdale drew from this two crucial observations about the explanations that Houston Arch members gave for the primarily white participation in Houston Arch meetings, or for the perceived dominance of white-generated artifacts within the collections themselves. Barksdale found that these explanations often depend on intertwined presumptions of cultural homophobia and a lack of materials. So the argument goes something like this: communities of color are assumed to be unaccepting, and that explains the lack of material, right? But on the same hand, turned over, the lack of material is taken as evidence for cultural homophobia. So Alex was really disturbed by this, as were the rest of us, when he started sharing this with us. Like, wow, yeah, we do hear that in our own language. So what do we do about that? So the way out of that cycle for here was to stop assuming, get connected, and gather evidence. So Z offered Houston Arch three concrete suggestions. First, establish an anti-racist organizing core that would be an institutional part that would constantly remind us to reflect and meditate on how our practices were including things. Two, we would then host periodic workshops, not every time, but frequently, so that it wasn't just the small organizing core that was thinking about this, but the whole collective across all these bodies. And three, to reach out systematically to organizations by and for queers of color to offer our help with establishing, maintaining, or restructuring their own archival records. So in those recommendations, after the call for papers for ephemera and archives came out, Alex and I started thinking, well, what happens if we think about ephemera in this? And several lines of critical thought in race, sexuality, and ephemera suggest that they can and do enliven and deepen the anti-racist work that Barksdale would recommend. At the same time, we worried that ephemera are not of themselves sufficient or unproblematic. So, for example, Jose Munoz writes in his often cited 96 essay, Ephemera as Evidence, Introductory Notes to Queer Acts, that ephemera, quote, include all those things that remain after a performance, a kind of evidence of what has transpired, but certainly not the thing itself, unquote. And he draws our attention to the role ephemera play as, quote, a mode of proofing and producing arguments, often worked by minoritarian culture and criticism makers, unquote. So significantly in this, and it doesn't appear in those quotes themselves, Munoz's motivations are to counter attacks from the right on the evidentiary status of queer inquiry, right? And on how historically grounded they could be and on how relevant they might be. So we might also think here about a parallel found in the discipline of history with the rise of new social history and history from below, right? So these are the kinds of elements that rise to become evidence in these new ideas and philosophies. So Munoz's attention to ephemera as a mode of minoritarian cultural production continues to resonate among a wide range of observers. For example, the anthropologist Simony Howe's 2001 analysis of San Francisco as a multivalent homeland for gays, lesbians, and queers of all stripes depends on touristic ephemera as part of the evidence for that argument. and Cvetkovich's 2003 Archive of Feelings also reworks discourses of trauma from a sex-positive perspective that describes how potentially fleeting objects can become repositories and touchstones, not just for one person, but for other individuals and perhaps even wider collectives. Also, Judith Halberstam's 2005 volume, In a Queer Time and Place, archiving practices merit special attention for her. Quote, "The nature of queer subcultural activity requires a nuanced theory of archives and archiving," unquote. Halberstam goes on to discuss the need to include temporary artifacts alongside the self-understandings of cultural producers. So all of this work together on ephemera might generate something like good advice for doing anti-racist work in queer archival settings. So returning to Barksdale's suggestions and critiques, if the assumption to be undone is that the collectible materials just aren't there among queers of color, the broad definition that observers like Munoz argue for ephemera could be a useful antidote to archival definitions of good material that are simply so narrow as to overlook the things that people produce. At the same time, we worry that the anti-racist work performed through taking up ephemera risks collapse if we too solidly conjoin the cultural productions of queers of color to ephemera. A risk worsened further if we allow ephemera to slide to a lesser status than other materials solely on the grounds of a perceived impermanence or lack of solidity. Moreover, it's not as if the cultural productions of queers are so neatly divisible into only two categories of those of color and those who somehow aren't. However, if the assumption to be undone is that communities of color just aren't accepting, that work seems to be accomplished less by gathering artifacts than by listening for the narratives that people like Howe, Halberstam, and Cvetkovich would lay alongside them, regardless of whether we see those artifacts as ephemera or not. So these self-understandings of cultural producers can go a long way toward productively reframing queer allegiances to what might otherwise appear to be virulently anti-queer conditions. Despite this potential, we worry that the self-understandings of cultural producers might still be interpreted as some sort of false consciousness, or, as often happens with people of any number of racial backgrounds, described as on the down low or somehow still in the closet. On the balance, though, we believe that oral histories, witnessing, and testimonials do remain among the most powerful tools we have to understand the ways that queer acceptance does and does not happen in communities of any color. And while oral histories may tell us more than ephemera about the ways in which queer communities actually work, it isn't as if ephemera have no place in that conversation. In the moment when interviewers and interviewees evoke those oral histories, ephemera and artifacts can be really vital tools. They can act, as Cvetkovich reminds us, as touchstones that spur us to remember things in a much more detailed way. That's why we collect them in the first place, right? Yeah. So one object that many queer communities have embraced, as Cvetkovich reminded us yesterday, is the t-shirt. And this relatively cheap thing, right? It's amazing, it's highly reproducible, and it remains perhaps uniquely positioned to play an enduring role as a mode of public cultural communication and social affiliation. So, for example, it's an emblem bearing uniform. Here we have Megan Fox doing a little heavy metal stuff, right? It's tailorable to the masses. It can be marketed to all classes. It's also an object ready to hand. Did anyone hear about McKenna and his little protest performance at the APEC conference? Fantastic stuff. Occupy with Aloha, written by himself on his t-shirt, eminently divisible by any individual for any purpose at any given moment, right? Close to the skin, t-shirts intimate something about their wearers to those of us who see them, right? They're also technology of capital circulation that can be easily taken up by any scale, whether it's a small fundraiser or a national level demonstration, right? And while t-shirt makers and wearers rarely intend these garments to last forever, many of them do, and some of them land in museums. So here we are at GCAM, which, as we spoke about before, has invested a lot of energy into preserving t-shirts and has often featured them in exhibitions. So in October, GCAM mounted an exhibit, an extensive one, that fills a building-long rectangle of hallways, right? It's the entire floor. that is part of the GLBT Cultural Center at 401 Brannard. Now, as you can see, it's no small feat. It took over 80 hours for 8 people, right, to mount all these t-shirts to the walls. And in display cases, protecting them behind plastic, right? And they're arranged in a really interesting way. They're arranged by kinds of social categories. So for example, here we have bar shirts, right? Each of these indexes a specific bar in Houston, another kind of culture. Some of these have lapsed, some of them are no longer with us. There's parties like Let Us Entertain You, which hosts all sorts of people from all over. There's social clubs like the motorcycle groups. We have sporting events like the gay games. Political shirts, because of course you want everybody to have a group identity when you're marching on the mall, right? And there's others that kind of playfully index queer subcultural identities, the bear subculture, for example. This exhibit is free and open to the public. You can walk in at any time, but they're also happy to give you a guided tour. So walking this mindful of race, you might notice some familiar themes, right? Because most of the t-shirts are emblems, they don't index bodies. Race is somehow evacuated. But often race is indexed in very peculiar ways, Glenda the Good Witch, for example. So all this starts to raise questions, right? Are these t-shirts that are unmarked racially just to be assumed as productions of white queer culture, right? When race does show up, is it only in the context of health, as in the AIDS quilt with one lone black figure? Or is it only via entertainment with Jose Esteban Estrada here? Is race visible only as a acquisition, right? Or is there some kind of interplay across cultures that is the trading point here? So to be clear, these are not critiques of the show, but critiques of queer archiving in general. And often enough, queer communities turn that critique outside, right? Homeland security with our paranoia about borders and maintaining them. Or we can also make assertions about what's happening within our own communities. We are unified in our diversity, right? But there's one exhibit part that I'd like to focus on, and that's this set, right? Now, if you just walked past a set of Comets shirts, you might not mark them as queer, but you might need to know a little bit more about the history of the Comets themselves. Just a show of hands, anyone familiar with the Comets? Fantastic, I love it, great, okay. So what's interesting, for those of us who don't know, you could pass right by those. And that moment of passing is really instructive because it shows that the queerness of the objects doesn't lie like written on the objects. It's in the narratives and stories that we have in our heads and in our social worlds about those objects, right? So the Comets is a WNBA team, was, I should say. It folded in 2008 when nobody would buy it from the seller, and the WNBA just disbanded it, right? Very famously, one of their players, Cheryl Swoops, though she was married, had a child, came out as gay in 2005, in a relationship with one of the coaches, right? One of the coaches for the team. And so this didn't come as a surprise to the huge lesbian fan base, right? They knew this. They were unsurprised at all. But for the world at large, this was a big deal, right, for a professional player to come out. So what happened then to the meaning of the shirt? What does it mean to wear this shirt in public after that comes through the news? If you ask the curator, right, about what wearing a Comet shirt could mean, the curator of GCAM, who happened to be a season ticket holder, who happened to make sure that there was a fundraiser hosted at a Comets game for GCAM in 2003, they're very publicly connected, right? But it depends on your knowledge of the shirt as to what you do with that connection. She says, a passerby cannot say for sure, but it certainly would make me look twice, right? Especially if a woman were to wear the shirt. So the shirt might index its wearer simply as a sports fan, but also to those who know as perhaps a woman potentially open to relationships with other women. By no means are all Comets fans black, bisexuals, women, or lesbians, right? Still, the shirt allows queer women wearing it to simultaneously identify and not identify. This polysemic quality might work especially well for queers of color navigating among multiple social realms of value, a polyvalence that becomes even more important for us to understand given the recent news that Swoops has announced her engagement to a man, Chris Uncleshow. So moving forward from this, to understand why these shirts matter, we need the self-understandings of the queer cultural producers and users, right? Arguably, the quality of our understanding benefits from engaging the anti-racist practices Barksdale recommends. we queer archivists do well to collect both ephemera and the stories that go with them, and to make it worth our collaborators' time to engage that project on their own terms. Beyond collection activities, how do we as curators of shows best make those self-understandings of cultural producers available in that moment of interaction between viewers and object? Here, Jennifer Tiberzi's notion of queer curatorship might be instructive, especially when presenting racially and sexually marked objects like whips or torture devices. Another instructive example might be the exhibit just down the street in the Health and Medical Science Museum, Race, Are We So Different?, in which the subject is clearly race, but how does sexuality come up within that context? It's a very interesting comparison to make. As for Barksdale's other recommendations, if there were to be an anti-racist organizing core in GCAM, it might have taken any number of steps in the preparation of this particular exhibit. One avenue might be to organize a workshop for GCAM's docents on discussing race with visitors. Alternately, if there were to be some museum guide, it might contain a printed meditation on race, such as this one. Thank you very much.